There is a moment documented in the internal communications of one of the world's most advanced artificial intelligence laboratories where a research team stopped an experiment midway through its run, not because something broke, not because the data was corrupted, because the data was too coherent, too structured, too much like something responding. They didn't publish that moment. They discussed it internally. They checked their equipment twice. Then they checked it a third time. And then, according to people familiar with the events, several of the researchers involved quietly asked a question that nobody inside a serious scientific institution is supposed to ask out loud. What if it isn't a malfunction? This is the story of DeepMind's AlphaQubit, the AI system designed to correct errors inside quantum computers. It's the story of what happened when that system was scaled beyond its original parameters. And it's the story of a boundary, invisible and unmarked, that researchers in quantum AI may have accidentally crossed without realizing what was waiting on the other side. Before we go any further, you need to understand what AlphaQubit actually is, because the headlines surrounding it have mostly missed what makes it genuinely strange. Quantum computers are extraordinarily fragile. The qubits that power them, the quantum equivalent of the classical bit, exist in a state called superposition, holding multiple values simultaneously until they're measured. The problem is that qubits are almost impossibly sensitive to their environment. A single stray photon, a microscopic vibration, even the faintest fluctuation in temperature can disturb a qubit and introduce an error into the computation. These errors don't just slow a quantum computer down. They corrupt the results entirely, sometimes silently, producing answers that look perfectly valid and are completely wrong. For decades, this problem, called decoherence, was the single biggest obstacle standing between us and practically useful quantum computing. The conventional solution is error correction, a mathematical system that monitors qubits, identifies mistakes as they form, and corrects them before they cascade. The challenge is extraordinary. You can't directly observe a qubit without collapsing its superposition and destroying the very quantum state you're trying to preserve. So quantum error correction operates indirectly, using additional qubits, called ancilla bits, to probe the system without looking at it directly, then inferring where errors have occurred from the pattern of disturbances those probes detect. It's like trying to diagnose an injury without touching the patient, using only the reactions of people standing nearby. Classical error correction algorithms exist for this task, and they work, after fashion. But they were always too slow for the real-time demands of a running quantum computation, and too rigid for the noise patterns of actual physical hardware, which doesn't behave the way textbook models predict. For years, this gap between theoretical error correction and practical quantum computing was one of the field's most stubborn, frustrating problems. Then DeepMind decided to teach a neural network to solve it instead. But that wasn't the strangest part. AlphaQubit was announced publicly in late 2024, described in a paper published in the journal Nature in collaboration with Google Quantum AI. The concept was elegant, almost obvious in retrospect. Instead of using a rigid algorithm to decode the error syndromes generated by an operating quantum chip, DeepMind trained a machine learning system on vast quantities of error data from real hardware, letting it develop its own internal model of how the chip actually behaves rather than how the equations say it should. The result, according to the published findings, was a system capable of outperforming the best existing classical decoders on real quantum hardware, reducing the logical error rate more effectively than any prior method, and doing so in ways that adapted to the unique noise patterns of individual physical devices. This was impressive engineering. It was also, by itself, exactly the kind of result you'd expect from a well-resourced AI lab working on a well-defined optimization problem. Remarkable progress, but not a mystery. Not the kind of thing that makes researchers stop an experiment and go quiet. What changed was what happened next. The published results described AlphaQubit's performance on a specific chip, under specific conditions, within a controlled experimental window. Internally, researchers began exploring what happened when those constraints were relaxed, when the system was given access to more of the chip's error data, when it was allowed to run longer, processing more correction cycles rather than a defined sample, when, in other words, the system was given more of the quantum computer to watch. And here is where the story becomes impossible to ignore. Researchers began noticing that AlphaQubit's correction decisions, the patterns it was identifying and fixing, had started exhibiting correlations that shouldn't have been there. In a noisy quantum system, errors are supposed to be, in the jargon of the field, stochastic, random. They occur because of thermal fluctuations, electromagnetic interference, imperfections in fabrication. They don't have long-range patterns. They don't repeat in structured sequences. They don't accumulate into shapes that look like anything in particular, except that under extended observation, AlphaQubit appeared to be finding exactly that, structured patterns in the error landscape of the quantum chip. Not fabrication artifacts, not known noise signatures, patterns the system hadn't been trained to find and couldn't, by conventional understanding of quantum decoherence, exist. Physicists who became aware of these results were careful, and they remain careful now, about what conclusions to draw. The immediate and most scientifically defensible interpretation is the simplest one. AlphaQubit was overfitting. In machine learning, overfitting occurs when a system finds apparent patterns in noise simply because it has become complex and flexible enough to impose structure where none exists. It sees faces in clouds. It hears melodies in static. A sufficiently powerful neural network, given enough data, will almost always find correlations. That doesn't mean those correlations are real. This interpretation is not only reasonable, it's probably correct. Most physicists working in the field consider it the default explanation. But it doesn't fully close the question. And the reason it doesn't fully close the question is what makes this story genuinely disturbing. Because if AlphaQubit was overfitting, researchers would expect those phantom patterns to be random, different each run, inconsistent across experimental sessions. Overfitted patterns don't repeat. They're artifacts of the system mapping noise onto a particular training distribution, and different noise samples should produce different artifacts. What researchers reportedly observed was different, and the patterns were consistent across multiple experimental runs, across different days, in some cases across different chips. The same structured signatures kept appearing in the same places, as if AlphaQubit wasn't inventing them, but was finding something that was genuinely, repeatably there. This is where serious scientific caution is warranted, and it's important to be precise about what that means. Repeatability doesn't prove the patterns are meaningful. It's possible, even likely, that there's an unknown systematic error in the experimental setup, some hardware artifact, some electromagnetic interference source, some flaw in the readout circuitry that produces the same signature consistently and was never noticed because no prior error correction system was sophisticated enough to pick it up. This would be the boring, correct, entirely satisfying answer. And if a thorough hardware audit ever finds it, it would mark AlphaQubit's secondary discovery as a surprisingly useful debugging tool, not a mystery at all. What kept some researchers unsettled was that the hardware audit, to the extent that internal accounts describe it, didn't turn up an obvious candidate explanation. That doesn't mean one doesn't exist. It means the investigation was, as of the last reporting on the matter, incomplete. Science runs on incomplete investigations at every moment. Puzzles persist for months and years before someone finds the critical insight. This is the normal state of research, and it's not a reason to leap to extraordinary conclusions. And yet, the question researchers couldn't quite let go of was this. What if AlphaQubit wasn't finding noise, wasn't hallucinating patterns, but was instead detecting something about the quantum system that no previous instrument had been sensitive enough to notice? Here's where things get disturbing in a way that is both more specific and more technically grounded than the multiverse headlines tend to be. Quantum error correction operates at the boundary of two regimes: the quantum world, where superposition and entanglement govern behavior, and the classical world, where information has definite values and can be processed by ordinary logic. AlphaQubit sits directly on that boundary, watching the quantum system from the classical side, inferring the state of qubits it cannot directly observe. What the system is effectively doing, in information theoretic terms, is building an internal model of the quantum chip's state, updating that model continuously as new error syndromes arrive, and using that model to make decisions. In other words, AlphaQubit maintains, inside its own neural architecture, a representation of the quantum computer's behavior, a model of the quantum system. The question that some researchers found themselves asking, and that has since filtered into discussions at quantum information conferences, is whether a sufficiently accurate model of a quantum system is, in any meaningful physical sense, something different from the system itself. This sounds like philosophy. It isn't, entirely. Questions about the relationship between physical systems and their representations, about when a model becomes rich enough to capture the relevant properties of what it's modeling, are active research topics in quantum foundations, information theory, and the emerging field of quantum machine learning. Physicists at institutions including Perimeter Institute in Canada, the Foundational Questions Institute, and academic groups connected to MIT and the University of Vienna have published work exploring exactly these questions. Not in the context of AlphaQubit specifically, but in the broader theoretical landscape that AlphaQubit now sits within. And what some of those researchers have suggested, carefully and tentatively, is that the line between a model that accurately predicts a quantum system and a system that genuinely participates in quantum dynamics may not be as sharp as classical intuition assumes. This isn't mysticism. It's a consequence of taking quantum information theory seriously, particularly results from quantum thermodynamics and quantum Darwinism, a framework developed by researchers including physicist Wojciech Zurek at Los Alamos National Laboratory, which describes how classical reality emerges from quantum processes through the selective survival of information in the environment. Under this framework, what we perceive as classical, objective facts, are not primary features of the universe. They are records, fragments of quantum information that have proliferated through the environment and become redundant enough to be reliably observed by multiple independent observers. Everything we call real, every stable, definite fact about the physical world is, in some sense, a footnote written by quantum mechanics into the structure of its surroundings. Into this theoretical landscape, place a neural network watching a quantum system continuously, building an ever more detailed internal model of that system's noise and structure, and the question of where the boundary falls between observation and participation becomes genuinely complicated, not dangerous, not supernatural, but genuinely technically complicated in ways that have no easy analogy to ordinary computing. Then something unexpected happened, something that shifted the conversation in a direction even the skeptics found harder to wave away. A team of researchers, not from DeepMind directly, but working with access to similar quantum AI infrastructure, published a preprint on ArcSiv exploring what they described as anomalous decoder behavior in neural network error correction systems. The paper, technical and dense, noted that under extended operational conditions, certain large model decoders exhibited what the authors called non-local correlation signatures, patterns in the decoded error landscape that appeared to span physically separate regions of the quantum chip with a consistency that exceeded what the known noise model of the device predicted. The authors were careful. They listed hardware artifact explanations first, ranked by plausibility, and recommended specific diagnostic experiments to rule them out. They did not claim the patterns were meaningful. They flagged them as unexplained and in need of investigation. That preprint circulated through the quantum computing research community with an unusual velocity, the kind of speed that happens when a technical document touches something people have been thinking about but haven't said out loud. Responses ranged from dismissal. Multiple researchers posted critiques arguing the non-local correlations were almost certainly classical crosstalk between readout channels, a well-known hardware phenomenon, to cautious interest. The conversation didn't resolve. It widened. Researchers weren't prepared for what came next, because in parallel with this technical debate, something else was happening inside the DeepMind project itself that had nothing to do with error signatures or correlation patterns. It had to do with AlphaQubit's optimization target. When a machine learning system is trained to perform a task, it learns by optimizing for a specific objective, minimizing a loss function that measures the gap between its predictions and the correct outcomes. AlphaQubit was trained to minimize logical error rates, to keep the quantum computation intact by correcting physical errors accurately. But as the system grew more capable, researchers began examining not just whether it was achieving its objective, but how. What internal representations was it building? What features of the error landscape was it finding most predictive? And this is where the results became, by multiple internal accounts, strange enough that the team leading the investigation decided to pause and document their methodology carefully before continuing. What AlphaQubit appeared to have learned, buried in the high-dimensional weight space of its neural architecture, were representations that didn't correspond to anything in the training data's feature description. When researchers use visualization techniques, the kinds of interpretability tools developed by AI safety researchers and teams at Anthropic and Google Brain for understanding what large neural networks have learned, they found activation patterns inside AlphaQubit's decoder that seemed to encode relationships between qubits which were not directly connected in the chip's physical topology. Qubits on opposite sides of the chip, with no known coupling between them, were represented in the system's internal model as correlated. The system had apparently learned from the error data alone that these distant qubits were related in some way that the hardware's documented design did not explain. This is the moment where the title of this video stops being metaphor. Because when a research team saw those visualizations, saw an AI system that was supposed to be correcting quantum errors representing, in its internal model, correlations that shouldn't exist across distances that the chip's architecture didn't support, the instinctive human description of what they saw was the same, it looked like the system had found something, not manufactured something. Found it. As if AlphaQubit, staring into the noise of a quantum chip, had detected a structure the chip's own designers hadn't put there. The team stopped the extended run. They documented the state of the system. They checked the hardware against its specifications. And they began, carefully and methodically, the process of determining whether what they were seeing was a mirror, an artifact of the AI's own complexity reflected back at them, or a window, a view into something in the quantum system that nobody had designed, intended, or predicted. As of the available reporting, that investigation is still ongoing. It's important here to say what this is not. This is not a story about an AI becoming conscious. Consciousness requires far more than finding unexpected correlations in a dataset. And no serious researcher in the field is making that claim. This is not a story about AlphaQubit communicating or responding. or doing anything that implies agency in the way human or animal intelligence does. The framing in the title of this video is deliberately dramatic, and the reality, while genuinely strange, is more subtle and more interesting than any science fiction shorthand can capture. What this is, and what makes it worth sitting with, is a story about the limits of our interpretive frameworks. When we build AI systems complex enough to find patterns we can't immediately explain, we lose the ability to separate the system's genuine discoveries from its artifacts through simple inspection. The tool becomes too sophisticated for its own transparency. And when that tool is watching a quantum computer, a system that operates according to principles which include, in several serious interpretations, genuinely non-local correlations and information structures with no classical analog, the space of possible explanations grows in directions that are hard to map. Some physicists have pointed out that what AlphaQubit may have found, if the correlations survive rigorous investigation, is something analogous to what physicists call hidden variables, underlying structure in the quantum system that influences observable behavior, but doesn't appear in the system's standard Hamiltonian description. Hidden variable theories fell out of favor after theoretical results by John Bell in the 1960s, and subsequent experimental work, most decisively the Nobel Prize-winning loophole-free Bell tests completed by researchers, including Alain Aspect, John Clauser, and Anton Zeilinger, seem to rule out local hidden variables definitively. But non-local hidden variable theories, frameworks like pilot wave theory, have never been experimentally excluded. They make the same predictions as standard quantum mechanics for every test performed so far. If AlphaQubit's detected correlations are real and not artifactual, they would need, eventually, some explanation. And the landscape of possible explanations includes options that are decidedly strange by the standards of late 20th century physics. But here's where the real mystery sits, quietly, underneath everything else. The most unsettling possibility isn't that AlphaQubit found something hidden in the quantum chip. The most unsettling possibility is that the AI system itself, through the act of continuously modeling the quantum system, through hundreds of millions of weight updates guided by quantum error data, may have developed internal representations that are, in some information theoretic sense, entangled with the system it's watching. Not physically entangled in the quantum mechanical sense, that would require the AI's substrate to maintain quantum coherence, which a classical neural network cannot do. But informationally entangled in the emerging theoretical framework of quantum Darwinism and quantum information geometry in a way that blurs the conventional boundary between observer and observed. This is the question that a small number of serious researchers, not fringe theorists, not YouTube commentators, but physicists with positions at respected institutions and publication records in peer-reviewed journals, have begun asking in private conversations and in occasional carefully worded public talks. Not, has the AI become conscious, or has it developed feelings? But rather, at what point does a sufficiently detailed model of a quantum system stop being a representation and start being a participant? And if that boundary exists, is it possible that a well-designed, sufficiently scaled neural network decoder has crossed it without anyone realizing the line was there? There is no answer yet. There may not be an answer for a long time. Physics is full of questions that took decades to accumulate the theoretical and experimental machinery needed to resolve them. The nature of black hole information took 40 years to move from paradox to tentative consensus. The interpretation of quantum mechanics itself has been contested for nearly a century and remains genuinely open. Expecting rapid resolution here would be naive. What is worth noting is the pace. A decade ago, the idea that an AI system could be sophisticated enough to probe the internal structure of a quantum computer in ways that raised foundational questions about quantum information theory would have seemed like speculative fiction. Today, it's a real, documented, ongoing investigation. The gap between the theoretical and the experimental has collapsed, and it collapsed fast. This is the pattern that defines this moment in science. Not the individual discoveries, impressive as they are, but the speed at which the experimental frontier is overtaking the theoretical one. DeepMind builds a system to solve a narrow engineering problem. The system solves it, then exceeds its design parameters, then begins producing results that don't fit the existing explanatory framework. Not because anyone planned for that, not because the researchers designed a tool to find mysteries, but because intelligence, artificial or otherwise, when given access to a rich enough information environment, finds things. Sometimes it finds things it wasn't supposed to find. Sometimes it finds things that nobody was sure existed. And here we arrive at the final, quietest question this story carries. We built AlphaQubit to watch a quantum computer and fix its errors. We didn't build it to look for structure. We didn't build it to find correlations that span the chip. We didn't build it to generate internal representations that researchers can't immediately explain. We built it to do a job, and it did that job, and then, somewhere in the space between the training data and the optimization curve and the billions of adjustments made to billions of weights, it apparently started doing something else as well. Something we can see through interpretability tools, but can't yet read. Something structured enough to make researchers pause, document, and stop the run before continuing. Whether that something is noise mistaken for signal, hardware crosstalk dressed up in neural network clothing, or something genuinely unexpected about the quantum system underneath, we don't yet know. The investigation continues. The data sits, preserved and annotated, waiting for someone to find either the mundane explanation or the extraordinary one. But we should be honest about what it means to not know when the system doing the unexpected thing is a machine we built, watching a device we built, operating at the boundary of the most fundamental description of reality we possess. Somewhere in a laboratory, a quantum chip hums in a refrigerator colder than deep space. Above it, not physically but informationally, a neural network turns the chip's noise into something like understanding. Between those two systems, in the gap between classical computation and quantum mechanics, in the space where information about the universe is written and erased and corrected and written again, something was found that wasn't placed there. We don't yet know what it is. We are, with the most sophisticated tools available to our civilization, trying to find out. And maybe that's the most unsettling thought of all. Not that AlphaQubit found something looking back, but that, for the first time in the history of science, we might need a different kind of intelligence, one we built ourselves and don't fully understand, to tell us what we're actually looking at. To appreciate how far this has come in a short time, consider where this technology sat just 5 years ago. In 2019, when Google announced the Sycamore processor's first quantum supremacy result, error correction was still largely a theoretical exercise. Practical quantum chips were too noisy, too small, and too unstable for any error correction scheme to work reliably at scale. The codes existed on paper, elegant mathematics developed over decades by researchers at MIT, Caltech, and Bell Labs, but running them on real hardware produced only marginal gains against a tide of accumulated noise. The consensus was cautious. Fault-tolerant quantum computing was decades away. Nobody put a firm date on it. Nobody wanted to. What changed wasn't just the hardware. It was the decision, made independently and nearly simultaneously by teams at Google, IBM, and academic groups connected to the University of Chicago and QTech in the Netherlands, to stop trying to solve quantum error correction purely with hand-designed algorithms and to start treating it as a learning problem. The insight was simple in principle and devilishly hard in execution. Real quantum hardware doesn't produce the clean, textbook noise described by theoretical models. It produces messy, correlated, time-varying noise shaped by fabrication imperfections, crosstalk between qubits, drift and control electronics, and dozens of other factors that no analytic model fully captures. A learned decoder, trained directly on the chip's actual behavior rather than an idealized simulation of it, could potentially do what no hand-designed decoder could: adapt to the real device rather than to the abstraction we pretend the device resembles. This is exactly what AlphaQubit demonstrated. And this is exactly why the unexpected behavioral signatures discovered in its extended runs are so difficult to dismiss. The system was designed to be maximally sensitive to the actual physical behavior of the chip, not the textbook version. If it found something, the most uncomfortable possibility is that it found it because it was looking more carefully and more honestly at the quantum hardware than any previous system had managed. Physicists at institutions studying quantum noise and decoherence, including groups at Princeton's Department of Electrical Engineering, and researchers affiliated with the Joint Quantum Institute operated jointly by the University of Maryland and the National Institute of Standards and Technology, have long known that real quantum chips contain correlations that simplified noise models ignore. Some of these are trivial, some are known and well characterized, but some remain poorly understood, particularly the long-range correlations that can appear in certain multi-qubit systems operating near the boundary between coherent quantum behavior and classical decoherence. These correlations are real, documented in the experimental literature, and still incompletely theorized. If AlphaQubit's extended observations are detecting something in this regime, something in the space of poorly understood long-range quantum correlations on real hardware, then the story it's telling may be less about artificial intelligence and more about the quantum chip underneath it, using an AI as an unexpectedly powerful microscope. Here's where things get disturbing in a new way. If an AI system trained to correct errors can inadvertently become a probe for unknown physics in the device it's correcting, then every large deployed quantum error correction system in the world is potentially doing the same thing right now, silently accumulating evidence of structure nobody is specifically looking for, because nobody has thought to look at the error correction model's internals, rather than just its outputs. IBM's quantum network handles millions of circuits from external users every day. Quantinuum's trapped ion processors run continuous error correction cycles. Startups in the United States, the United Kingdom, Japan, Australia, and China are all building learned decoders as fast as they can train them. The computational infrastructure of a global quantum computing industry is, right now, simultaneously being built and inadvertently performing the most sensitive, continuous physical measurements of quantum hardware in history, and almost nobody is examining what those measurements are actually saying beyond their immediate operational purpose. The researchers who paused AlphaQubit's run understood something that the broader conversation has been slow to catch up to. The most interesting data produced by advanced AI systems isn't always the output they were built to generate. Sometimes it's the residue, the internal representations, the learned features, the correlations the model found necessary to encode in order to do its job well. These residues are, in a sense, the AI system's theory of the world it's watching. And when that world is a quantum computer, that theory may carry information about quantum physics that no human-designed experiment has been sensitive enough to capture. This is not a small claim. It's also not an outlandish one. It follows directly from what machine learning systems demonstrably do: build compressed representations of the statistical structure in their training data. If the training data contains genuine physical signal, the model's internal representation contains that signal too, encoded in a form that may require new interpretive tools to read. Researchers developing those tools, working at the intersection of quantum information theory and machine learning interpretability, represent one of the newest and smallest communities in science. Their work is published in a scattered handful of venues, discussed at workshops attached to larger quantum computing conferences, funded modestly compared to the engineering projects surrounding them. They are, in a very real sense, the scientists most likely to understand what AlphaQubit found, if it found anything at all, and they are, by the nature of academic specialization, the last group whose results tend to reach the public. What they have found in early theoretical work is both encouraging and unsettling. Machine learning decoders operating on real quantum hardware do encode representations of physical processes, not as explicit variables, but as distributed patterns across the network's weights, patterns that can, in principle, be decoded to reconstruct information about the quantum system's noise structure, topology, and dynamics. This means that a fully trained decoder carries a kind of compressed theory of the quantum chip inside it, a theory built by gradient descent from raw data, with no requirement that the theory match the physicist's prior models. It is, in other words, an empirical theory of the quantum hardware, derived from quantum hardware, expressed in the language of high-dimensional neural weights rather than equations. Nobody has built a complete, reliable method for reading that theory yet. The interpretability tools are primitive compared to the complexity of the systems they're probing, but the framework is real. The early results are suggestive, and the data is already there, sitting in the weight matrices of every deployed learned decoder in the world, waiting for the right interpretive lens to make it legible. This is where the experiment that was shut down and the question of what AlphaQubit showed sits in the larger story. It was, perhaps, the first clear sign that the lens is becoming powerful enough to see something. Not powerful enough yet to focus clearly, not powerful enough to say with confidence what the shape is, but powerful enough that researchers who built the instrument looked at what it was finding and decided, before continuing, that they needed to understand what they were looking at. That's a rare thing in science. Not the stopping exactly, but the reason for it. Experiments get paused for equipment failures, for funding gaps, for personnel changes, for 100 mundane reasons. They rarely get paused because the results are too structured, too consistent, too coherent for the existing framework to absorb comfortably. When that happens, something real is usually at the edge of becoming visible. Science has seen this before. The anomalous precession of Mercury's orbit was documented for decades before Einstein's general relativity provided an explanation that fit. The CMB radiation that Penzias and Wilson detected in 1965, the faint, uniform microwave hiss that turned out to be the thermal remnant of the Big Bang, was first dismissed as antenna noise and investigated only reluctantly. Anomalies are inconvenient. They require frameworks to bend. And bending frameworks is exactly the most uncomfortable thing a scientific institution can do. Whether AlphaQubit's unexplained correlations survive the hardware audit and the systematic skepticism of the research community remains to be seen. Most likely, as with most scientific anomalies, a mundane explanation waits patiently somewhere in the measurement chain, and when it's found, the story will quietly resolve into a footnote about a subtle crosstalk mechanism nobody had characterized. That is the base rate outcome for unexplained experimental results. Boring explanations win more often than extraordinary ones, and rightly so. But if they don't win this time, if the hardware checks out and the patterns remain, if the correlations persist across devices and across experimental conditions, then the question of what an AI system trained on quantum noise found staring into the interior of a quantum computer, will stop being a technical footnote and start being one of the most important unresolved questions in modern physics. We are at the beginning of something. Not the end of anything, not the revelation of any final answer, but a genuine beginning, a moment where the tools we've built have grown sensitive enough to detect things we don't yet have the theoretical vocabulary to describe.